The sound of the freezing rain was deafening, a relentless barrage against the grand windows of my childhood home, but it somehow could not drown out the sharp, violent scratch of my father's heavy gold fountain pen. He was dragging the nib across thick, textured parchment, pressing down so hard I thought the paper might tear. He was crossing my legal name off a binding family trust document. He was erasing me. My mother, Blythe, stood frozen near the entryway console, a fragile statue of anxiety. Her trembling fingers nervously twisted her expensive pearl necklace, her eyes wide, but her mouth remained firmly shut. She was too terrified of ruining her fragile peace to intervene, too cowardly to stand up for her own flesh and blood. A few feet away, leaning casually against the mahogany doorframe, was my older sister, Sutton. She was smiling. It was a slow, deeply satisfied smirk, the kind of expression you see on a predator that has finally cornered its lifelong prey and is savoring the moment before the kill. I was 24 years old, standing on the sprawling front porch of the only home I had ever known. I was shivering in the freezing downpour with nothing but a cheap canvas duffel bag resting at my wet boots. The wind howled through the manicured trees of our estate, pushing the rain sideways into the grand foyer, ruining the pristine antique rug my mother prized so much. But my father, Orson, a man who built his entire identity on the foundation of commercial real estate and local prestige, did not care about the rug tonight. His face was flushed a deep, terrifying shade of crimson, his chest heaving with venomous rage. "You get nothing," my father roared, his voice echoing through the wealthy, silent streets of Oakhaven. The sheer volume of his voice seemed to cut through the thunder. He grabbed my duffel bag and hurled it out into the mud, not caring that my few remaining possessions were spilling out into the wet grass. "You are a worthless loser, Marin. You dragged this family name through the dirt because you would rather scrub warehouse floors and play with scrap metal than sit in a respectable boardroom. You want to live like a rat? Go freeze on the streets. You are erased from this family. You are erased from my will." He slammed the heavy oak door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sickening, final thud that vibrated through the floorboards and straight into my chest. A second later, the porch light flicked off, plunging me into total darkness. I was branded a disgrace. A failure. A child who dared to choose her own gritty, practical path instead of acting as a polished puppet for a toxic family obsessed with their pristine, fake public image. They threw me out into the bitter cold, fully expecting that I would crawl back begging in a few days, or worse, that I would just fade away into miserable obscurity. They thought they had destroyed me. But they had no idea that being pushed into the pitch-black dark was exactly what I needed to finally learn how to see. They had no idea that a decade later, the worthless daughter they discarded like trash would go on to build an industrial empire bringing in $45 million a year. They thought they wrote the final, pathetic chapter of my life that night. But if you have ever been the scapegoat, the invisible child, the one who takes the blame for everyone else's deep-seated insecurities, you know that survival breeds a very specific, dangerous kind of hunger. What followed wasn't just my survival. It was a systematic, brutal dismantling of their entire fake reality, piece by piece. But to understand how I brought my father's glittering empire crashing down to the dirt, you need to understand the hell I had to walk through first. I stood there in the dark for what felt like an eternity. The rain soaked through my thin jacket, chilling my skin, but I did not cry. I want to make that clear. It was not out of some brave, heroic stoicism. It was because a profound, chilling numbness had settled deep into my bones. The kind of silence that falls over a condemned building right before the wrecking ball makes impact. My mind was eerily quiet. For my entire life, I had tried to earn their approval. I had tried to mold myself into the perfect daughter they wanted, only to realize that the mold was always designed for Sutton, and I was just the spare material they loved to throw away. My crime, the terrible offense that led to my violent banishment, was simple. I had dropped out of a prestigious corporate law program to pursue commercial logistics and warehousing. While Sutton, the golden child, paraded around as a public relations director, building a flawless social media aesthetic funded by her wealthy husband, I was fascinated by supply chains, rusty shipping containers, and abandoned industrial lots. Orson built luxury retail plazas, glittering monuments to vanity. He wanted me to be a ruthless corporate lawyer to protect his assets and maintain the illusion of high society dominance. When I told him I wanted to buy a dilapidated warehouse on the edge of town and turn it into a high-tech distribution hub, he looked at me like I had spat on his shoes. To Orson, manual labor and industrial dirt were for the lower class. The Thorne name belonged on glass towers and champagne flutes, not forklift manuals and steel beams. Sutton fueled the fire, whispering in his ear that I was unstable, that I was embarrassing her by wearing work boots instead of designer heels, that my presence at her social events was a liability. And Blythe, my enabler mother, just nodded along, desperate to keep the peace, even if it meant sacrificing her youngest daughter to the wolves. I walked over to the muddy grass and picked up my scattered clothes. A pair of jeans, a few t-shirts, a toothbrush. I shoved them back into the soaked canvas bag. I looked up at the glowing windows of the Thorne estate one last time. I could see the silhouette of my sister in the upstairs window, watching me leave, probably sipping a glass of wine. I turned my back to the house and walked down the long, winding driveway. I walked miles through the relentless rain to a cheap motel on the outskirts of Oakhaven. As I walked, a realization crystallized in my mind. They did not hate me because I was failing. They hated me because I refused to play the game they were all trapped in. They were terrified of reality, and I represented the real world. Walking away that night, I made a silent bow to the pouring rain and the empty road. I would never be helpless again. I would never ask them for a single dime, a single favor, or a single moment of their time. I would build a kingdom out of the dirt they despised. Have you ever felt that exact moment when your heart turns to ice and you know you will never be the same person again? The human mind has a funny way of cataloging trauma. I call it the Museum of Pain. During my first few months on my own, living in a drafty, unheated storage unit and scraping together whatever manual labor jobs I could find, the exhibits in my mental museum were the only things keeping me awake at night. They were the fuel in my engine, burning hot and toxic. Exhibit A, the High School Debate Championship. I was 16, standing on a brightly lit stage holding a massive first-place trophy, scanning the audience for my parents. I had worked for months on that speech. I had stayed up late rehearsing in front of my bedroom mirror. But the seats I saved for them remained empty. They never showed up. When I finally got a ride home from a teacher, I walked into the house to find Orson and Blythe fawning over Sutton in the living room. Sutton was throwing a massive tantrum because her custom prom dress had arrived with the wrong shade of sequins. My trophy sat on the kitchen counter for a week, gathering dust, before the maid accidentally threw it in the trash. No one noticed it was gone. Exhibit B, my first car. I worked double shifts at a diner for an entire year to buy a beat-up, reliable sedan. It smelled like old coffee and the upholstery was torn, but it was mine. I paid for it with my own sweat. I was so proud. When I pulled it into our grand circular driveway, hoping for just a nod of acknowledgement, Orson walked out of the front door. He looked at the car with pure disgust, wrinkled his nose, and told me to park that piece of garbage down the street because it was ruining the aesthetic of his landscaping. He said it made the house look like a foreclosed property. Exhibit C, the sketches. Just a year before they kicked me out, I drew up a detailed, ambitious business plan for converting abandoned lots into modern logistics hubs. I had spent weeks researching zoning laws, profit margins, and supply chain demands. I left the binder on the dining table, hoping Orson would read it over his morning coffee and finally see my potential as a businesswoman. Instead, Blythe threw it into the fireplace, claiming she thought it was scrap paper cluttering her perfectly staged dining room. When I confronted her, she just waved her hand and told me to stop playing with silly drawings and focus on finding a wealthy husband like Sutton did. Those memories did not break me, they forged me. I left the toxic bubble of Oakhaven and moved to Northbridge, a gritty, forgotten industrial town 200 miles away. Nobody cared about the Thorne legacy out there. Nobody cared what kind of car you drove or what designer label was on your collar. They only cared if you could work hard, show up on time, and pay your bills. My first year was brutal. The kind of brutal that strips away everything weak inside you. I slept on flattened cardboard boxes inside a leaky warehouse I managed to lease with my meager savings. The roof leaked dirty water on my sleeping bag when it rained. My hands, once soft and manicured for my mother's country club dinners, became permanently calloused. My fingernails were constantly lined with grease and metal dust. I learned how to pour concrete, how to operate a forklift, how to negotiate with rough-around-the-edges truck drivers who initially laughed at a 24-year-old girl trying to give them orders. I learned how to spot a structural weakness in a steel frame from 20 yards away. I learned how to survive. I started Aegis Logistics with nothing but grit, spite, and a vision. I bought a foreclosed industrial lot using a high-interest loan I fought tooth and nail to secure. I fixed up the lot myself, repairing the fences, pouring new concrete pads, and upgrading the security systems. Then I leased it to a regional delivery company. The profit from that first deal went straight into buying 2 more lots. Then 5. Then I secured a contract to build a massive, automated distribution center for a major online retailer. The world was changing rapidly. Traditional retail was dying, moving online, and the demand for commercial warehousing and logistics skyrocketed. While Orson was back in Oak Haven building expensive, useless shopping malls that nobody visited, I was building the invisible backbone of modern commerce. 10 years passed. A decade of relentless, grueling, invisible labor. A decade of waking up at 4 in the morning and working until midnight. Aegis Logistics grew into a juggernaut. I hired brilliant engineers, cutthroat negotiators, and loyal construction crews who respected me because they knew I could do their jobs just as well as they could. By the time I turned 34, my company was generating $45 million in annual revenue. I owned commercial real estate across 3 different states. I had a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking my largest distribution hub. But I kept my name entirely out of the press. I had no public social media presence. My corporate structure was deeply layered behind various holding companies and legal trusts. To the outside world, the CEO of Aegis was just a signature on a page. I was a ghost. I framed it to my board as a smart business move, keeping competitors in the dark, but deep down, the motivation was intensely personal. I did not want my father to ever take credit for my success. I wanted him to remain firmly convinced that I was a dirty, worthless failure, right up until the very moment I proved him wrong. I had built an iron fortress around my life. I was untouchable, wealthy beyond anything my family could fathom, and finally at peace in my anonymity. No one from Oak Haven had spoken to me in 10 years. My sister continued her shallow, parasitic existence, my parents continued their exhausting charade, and I continued building my empire of steel and concrete. But the universe has a wicked sense of irony. I thought I had severed every single tie to my past. I thought the toxic roots of the Thorne family could not reach me in Northbridge. I was wrong. A tiny, forgotten thread was still connecting me to the people who despised me, and someone had been quietly pulling on it for a very long time. What happens when the fortress you built to protect yourself is breached from the inside? It started on a gloomy Tuesday morning. The sky over Northbridge was a bruised purple, threatening rain. Maya, my newly hired chief financial officer, knocked gently on the heavy glass door of my office. Maya was a shark disguised as a polite accountant. She had a meticulous, obsessive nature that I valued deeply. We were in the process of consolidating several of my older, personal financial portfolios into a new corporate wealth management structure, ensuring my assets were ironclad. She walked in and slid a thick printed ledger across my massive oak desk. Her brow was furrowed, and she did not offer her usual morning greeting. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a highlighted column on the 3rd page of the report. "Marin, I found an anomaly," Maya said, her voice tight and professional, but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "It is an old college dependency account. Jointly held. You have not actively used it in 10 years, but there is a steady, automated trickle of residual dividends feeding into it from an old high school trust fund." I frowned, staring at the paper. I recognized the account number. It was an account Orson had forced me to open when I was 18, a mechanism he claimed was for emergencies, but in reality, it was just another way for him to monitor my spending habits and exert control. I had walked away from it the night I was kicked out, assuming the meager funds would just sit there gathering dust, forgotten by everyone. I never bothered to officially close it because interacting with my father was a line I refused to cross. So, just close it out and move the remaining funds to a charity, I said dismissively, returning my attention to the warehouse blueprints spread across my desk. I cannot. And neither can you, not easily, Maya replied, leaning in closer. But that is not the primary issue. The issue is that the money isn't just sitting there. Someone has been draining it. Systematically. For 6 years. The air in my office suddenly felt very thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I dropped my pen and pulled the ledger closer, my eyes scanning the endless rows of small, repetitive withdrawals. $300 here. $800 there. $1,000 right before the holidays. The amounts were small enough to avoid triggering any major fraud alerts or phone calls from the bank, but consistent enough to cause significant damage over time. They were digital transfers, executed cleanly, quietly, over a period of 72 months. How much? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. $65,000, Maya answered flatly, her eyes locking onto mine. A cold, heavy sensation settled into the pit of my stomach. $65,000. It was a rounding error for Aegis Logistics now. I spent more than that on security upgrades for a single warehouse. But it was not about the amount. It was the principle. It was the gross violation of boundaries. Someone had been treating my forgotten account like their own personal ATM, quietly stealing from the woman they thought was living in a ditch. Who? I demanded, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. Maya flipped to the next page of the report, revealing the bank's user access logs. The transfers were authorized by a secondary user. Someone who was added to the account years ago, likely by your father for administrative convenience. His name is Lachlan. Lachlan. My sister Sutton's husband. The golden son-in-law. The private equity director who wore custom-tailored suits, drove imported sports cars, and smoked cigars on the country club patio. The man who stood next to my sister in perfect holiday photos, oozing wealth, success, and insufferable superiority. I sat back in my leather chair, the silence in the room thickening until it felt hard to breathe. Lachlan had been stealing from me. The man who funded Sutton's picture-perfect lifestyle was quietly siphoning money from the sister they all publicly mocked as a penniless loser. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of it made my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. He assumed I was too poor, too stupid, and too disconnected from reality to ever notice a slow bleed on an old account. Where is the money going? I asked, my tone sharp enough to cut glass. That is where it gets complicated, Maya said, adjusting her glasses and looking at her tablet. It is not going to a personal checking account or a standard credit card payment. It is being funneled into a highly obscured corporate holding fund. It is a shell company. I cannot trace the final destination of the funds without a legal subpoena, and initiating that process would alert the account holders. The primal, angry part of my brain screamed at me to pick up the phone, call Lachlan's office, and threaten him with total ruination. I wanted to hear his arrogant voice crack with panic. I wanted to tell him that the loser sister was currently a multimillionaire who could afford to bury him in lawsuits until his grandchildren were bankrupt. But a CEO who manages $45 million does not act on impulse. If I confronted him now, he would panic, cover his tracks, and sever the connection before I could figure out what he was really doing with that money. Call the bank, I instructed Maya, trying to keep my voice steady. Freeze the account immediately. Maya shook her head slowly. I already tried. I spent an hour on the phone with their executive team. The dependency structure your father set up requires dual authorization to freeze or close the account. We need Orson's physical signature, notarized in person, to stop the bleeding. If we petition the bank unilaterally to lock it down due to fraud, they are legally required to notify all parties involved. Lachlan will know we are onto him, and Orson will know you are looking into the family finances. I was trapped by a piece of paper signed when I was a teenager. To stop the theft, I needed the cooperation of the very man who threw me into the street. The irony was bitter, tasting like ash in my mouth. I had built an impenetrable fortress, but they still had a rusty key to the back door, and they were using it to pick my pockets while smiling for the cameras. "Leave it open," I finally said, the decision solidifying in my mind like setting concrete. "Do not touch it. Let him keep taking it." Maya stared at me like I had lost my mind. "Marin, he is stealing from you. It is a crime." "I know it is," I replied, a dark, terrible calm washing over me. "But right now, that stolen money is a tracking device. I am going to find out exactly what Lachlan is building with my cash. And then I am going to burn it to the ground. Let him think he is getting away with it for a little while longer." I dismissed Maya and stood by my office window, looking out over the sprawling, hyper-efficient logistics yard I had built. Hundreds of trucks were moving in perfect synchronization. The rage was still there, burning hot in my chest, but it was no longer chaotic. It was focused. A laser beam aimed directly at Oak Haven. I was not just going to cut off the leech. I was going to destroy the entire swamp. How far would you go to uncover the truth behind a family betrayal? I drove back to Oak Haven on a gray, overcast Thursday afternoon. It had been 10 long years since I last crossed the city limits, but the town felt exactly the same as I remembered. Suffocating. Pretentious. Obsessed with appearances and neighborhood gossip. I drove my modest, unmarked company SUV, wearing a simple black trench coat, dark sunglasses, and my hair tied back. I did not want to be recognized by anyone. I needed to observe the battlefield before I made a move. The first thing I saw when I entered the commercial district made my blood boil in my veins. It was a massive, glowing digital billboard featuring Orson's overly tanned face, heavily photoshopped to erase a decade of aging and stress. Beside his beaming face was an architectural rendering of a sprawling, ostentatious luxury shopping complex. The bold letters across the screen screamed, "The Pinnacle, redefining luxury retail in Oak Haven." I pulled over into a diner parking lot across the street and just sat there, staring at it. The Pinnacle. It was Orson's magnum opus. A massive outdoor mall designed to house high-end boutiques, artisan cafes, luxury jewelers, and a central fountain that nobody asked for. It was exactly the kind of vain, outdated project he loved to brag about at dinner parties. But looking at the sheer scale of the rendering, a very quiet, very analytical part of my logistics brain started doing the math. Retail was collapsing globally. E-commerce was slaughtering brick-and-mortar stores left and right. I knew this better than anyone on the planet because my company, Aegis Logistics, was the one delivering the fatal blows by streamlining online distribution and making physical storefronts obsolete. Building a massive luxury retail plaza in a mid-sized town like Oak Haven right now was not just risky, it was financial suicide. It was a dinosaur sinking into a tar pit. Where in the world was he getting the capital to fund such a massive disaster? I walked into the diner, keeping my head down, and ordered a black coffee at the counter. The place smelled of old grease, burnt toast, and local gossip, just like it did 10 years ago. I sat in a corner booth in the back, sipping my coffee and listening. In a town like Oak Haven, the local diner is better than the morning news. It did not take long before I heard my own name drop. Two well-dressed women in the booth next to mine, clutching designer handbags and wearing far too much perfume, were whispering over their Cobb salads. I recognized one of them immediately. It was Cressida, one of Blythe's awful country club friends, a woman who specialized in fake smiles and backhanded compliments. "Did you hear about the Thorns' youngest daughter?" Cressida murmured, her voice dropping into a theatrical whisper dripping with fake pity. "Orson told my husband just last week that she is living in a trailer park up north. Hooked on painkillers, apparently. It is such a tragedy. Blythe is practically a saint for enduring the heartbreak of having such a useless child." I gripped my coffee mug so hard my knuckles turned white. So that was the narrative they had constructed. I wasn't just a dropout who wanted to work in construction. I was a tragic, drug-addicted burden on society. They had spun an elaborate web of lies to explain my absence, painting themselves as the grieving, noble parents while turning me into a cautionary tale for the neighborhood. They had spent a decade assassinating my character to protect their own egos. Before I could process the sheer audacity of the lie, the bell above the diner door chimed. An older man walked in, looking exhausted, his work boots covered in drywall dust. I recognized him instantly. Gideon. He was a veteran contractor, a gruff but honest man who used to build the framing for Orson's residential projects when I was a teenager. He was the only person in my father's orbit who ever treated me with an ounce of respect, often answering my questions about structural engineering when Orson would tell me to go away. I waited until he ordered his coffee and sat heavily at the counter before I approached him. Gideon, I said softly, sliding into the stool next to him. He looked at me, squinting through his thick, dusty glasses. It took him a few seconds to look past the tailored coat and the confident posture, but when he recognized me, his eyes widened in sheer shock. Marin? Good Lord, girl. You look like $1,000,000. They said you were, well, you know what they said. I know what they said, I interrupted gently, offering a small, reassuring smile. It is a lie. I am doing very well for myself. But I need to know about my father, Gideon. I need to know the truth about the Pinnacle. Gideon let out a heavy, exhausted sigh, wrapping his rough hands around his mug. Once a contractor starts talking, the truth spills out like water from a broken pipe. It is a bloodbath, Marin, Gideon whispered, glancing around nervously to make sure nobody was listening. The Pinnacle is a sinking ship. Orson overleveraged everything he owns. The big anchor stores pulled out last year because of the online shopping boom. He couldn't get traditional bank loans to cover the construction deficit, so he started getting desperate. How desperate? I pressed, leaning in closer. He started taking private money, Gideon said, his voice laced with disgust. He promised huge, guaranteed returns to local business owners, the church renovation fund, even elderly retirees. He used his reputation in this town to bleed them dry. My own crew has not been paid in 3 months. If the Pinnacle goes under, Orson doesn't just go bankrupt. He takes half of Oakhaven's life savings down with him. The puzzle pieces clicked together with a sickening crunch in my mind. Orson was running a glorified Ponzi scheme to keep his vanity project alive. He was scamming the innocent people of Oakhaven to save face. And then the final, horrifying realization hit me like a freight train. Gideon, I asked, my heart pounding a slow, furious rhythm against my ribs. Lachlan, Sutton's husband. Is he involved in the Pinnacle? Gideon sneered, shaking his head. Lachlan is supposed to be the financial wizard, right? But rumors are swirling that he is secretly trying to buy up Orson's defaulted debt from the primary commercial lender. Some say he is using shadow funds to try and swoop in, take control of the project at a discount, and kick Orson out before the whole thing implodes. It is a snake pit, Marin. They are eating each other alive. I walked out of the diner and sat in my car, staring at the massive billboard of my father's face. Lachlan was not just stealing my money to fund Sutton's designer shoes. He was pooling that stolen $65,000, along with whatever other illicit funds he had access to secretly buy up the distressed debt of my father's failing project. The Golden son-in-law was planning a hostile takeover. They were all feeding on each other. A family of parasites. My stolen money was quietly funding the knife Lachlan was preparing to plunge into my father's back, while my father was actively destroying the livelihoods of innocent people to save his own ego. It was chaotic, evil, and deeply pathetic. I started the engine, a cold, ruthless smile spreading across my face. They thought they were playing a high-stakes game of chess. They had no idea someone was about to flip the entire board upside down. Would you step in to save the town, or let your toxic family destroy each other? I drove straight back to Northbridge, my mind operating at a terrifying speed. I needed a strategy. I needed to isolate Orson's debt and crush Lachlan's attempt to buy it. I was going to use Aegis Logistics' massive capital reserves to outbid Lachlan and become my father's primary creditor. But before I could mobilize my corporate lawyers to execute the takeover, my personal cell phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Marin Thorne? a crisp, professional voice asked. Speaking, I replied, merging onto the highway and turning down the radio. My name is Thaddeus. I am an attorney specializing in estates and trusts, based in the neighboring county. I represent the estate of your late aunt, Isolde Thorne. I have been instructed to contact you today, and today only. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Aunt Isolde was Orson's older sister. She was a fierce, independent woman who despised Orson's vanity and Blythe's superficiality. She was the only family member who ever looked at me with pride when I talked about logistics and supply chains instead of corporate law. She had passed away 2 years ago, and I had not attended the funeral, knowing my presence would only cause a circus and give Orson another reason to scream at me. "What is this about, Thaddeus?" I asked, my voice guarded. Isolde left a secure safety deposit box in my firm's vault, Thaddeus explained carefully. The stipulations of her will were absolute. The box was to be handed over exclusively to you, exactly 24 months after her passing. That day is today. She explicitly stated it contains no liquid assets, but rather legal documentation of extreme importance. Are you available to come to my office? I canceled my afternoon meetings immediately and drove straight to Thaddeus's office. The law firm was quiet, traditional, and smelled faintly of old paper, leather polish, and expensive coffee. Thaddeus, a sharp-eyed man in his 50s wearing a well-tailored suit, led me into a private conference room. He slid a heavy, worn metal lockbox across the mahogany table. Attached to the handle was a faded tag with my name, written in Aunt Isolde's elegant, sloping handwriting. He handed me a small brass key and politely left the room, giving me privacy. I took a deep breath, the metal cold against my calloused fingers. I turned the key. The latch clicked open with a sharp snap that echoed in the quiet room. Inside, sitting on a bed of faded red velvet, were 2 things, a sealed envelope and a thick, folded legal document bearing the official raised seal of the county clerk. I opened the envelope first. The letter was written on her personal, embossed stationery. My dearest Marin, if you are reading this, 2 years have passed, and I hope you have built the life of steel and substance I always knew you would. Your father, my foolish brother, only knows how to build illusions. He mistakes charm for structural integrity and arrogance for actual wealth. I have watched him leverage assets he does not truly respect, and I know exactly how his story ends. It ends in ruin. Decades ago, our father left a massive 60-acre tract of industrial land on the eastern edge of Oakhaven in a family trust. Orson has always treated it as his personal playground, assuming the trust would eventually default entirely to him to do with as he pleased. But 8 years ago, when the trust allowed for a discreet transfer of assets, I exercised my executive right as the senior trustee. I transferred the title of those 60 acres out of the family trust. I registered it quietly, legally, and permanently at the municipal recording office. I transferred it to you, Marin. You are the only Thorne who builds. You are the only one who creates real value from the dirt. The land is yours. It has been yours for 8 years. I delayed the delivery of this box because you needed time to grow strong enough to wield this weapon without them tearing it away from you. Use it wisely. Make them pay. Love, Aunt Isolde. My breath hitched in my throat. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped the letter onto the table. I grabbed the folded legal document and tore it open. It was an official property deed. Stamped, notarized, and undeniably legal. Full, unencumbered ownership of 60 acres on the eastern edge of Oakhaven. Transferred to Marin Thorne. I closed my eyes, a dizzying wave of adrenaline crashing over me. The 60 acres on the eastern edge of Oakhaven. It was not just an empty field of dirt and weeds. It was the exact plot of land where Orson was currently building the Pinnacle. My father was building a multi-million-dollar luxury complex on land he did not own. He had undoubtedly used that land as collateral to secure his massive commercial loans from the bank, assuming the outdated trust documents would satisfy the bank's rushed, negligent title verification process. He was committing massive, catastrophic bank fraud without even realizing it, because he was too arrogant to check the fine print of his own family trust. He had borrowed millions of dollars against my property. I sat alone in that quiet conference room, clutching a piece of paper that possessed the power to annihilate my father's entire existence. I was holding a nuclear bomb. I could walk into the local police station right now, present the deed, and have Orson arrested for fraud. I could watch the Pinnacle be seized by the state, leaving my father destitute, facing prison time, and humiliated in front of the entire town. But then I remembered Gideon's exhausted face in the diner. I remembered the retirees, the local business owners, the innocent people of Oakhaven who had poured their life savings into Orson's desperate Ponzi scheme because they trusted his fake smile. If I blew up the Pinnacle right now with a criminal fraud charge, the bank would freeze everything. The project would be locked in endless litigation. The innocent investors would lose every single penny they had. Orson would be destroyed, yes. But he would take the entire town down with him as collateral damage, leaving a crater of ruined lives. I folded the deed carefully and placed it in my tailored jacket pocket. I was not going to act like my father. I was not going to let innocent people suffer just to satisfy my thirst for revenge. I was going to execute a flawless surgical strike. I would save the people he scammed, and I would make sure Orson and Lachlan watched me do it. I pulled out my phone and dialed the direct line to my lead corporate acquisition attorney. "Cancel all my appointments for the rest of the month," I ordered, my voice steady, cold, and echoing with absolute authority. "We are going hunting. Thank you for watching this far. If you are thrilled to see Maren take control of her destiny and set the ultimate trap for her toxic family, hit that like button and make sure you are subscribed. The real destruction is about to begin." The following Monday morning, I sat at the head of the massive obsidian conference table in the Aegis Logistics headquarters. The panoramic windows offered a sweeping view of my primary distribution yard, a sprawling expanse of automated machinery and endless lines of freight trucks. But my focus was entirely on the encrypted conference call echoing from the speakerphone. My lead acquisitions attorney, a ruthless and brilliant man named Marcus, was outlining the battlefield. The commercial bank holding Orson's defaulted loans was desperate to offload the toxic debt. They were preparing to sell it for pennies on the dollar to anyone willing to assume the immense recovery risk. It is a standard procedure in distressed debt, but this particular auction was happening quietly in the shadows. "The bank is eager to scrub this from their quarterly reports," Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker, crisp and entirely devoid of emotion. "They are bundling the promissory notes, the construction liens, and the underlying collateral. Whoever buys this paper essentially becomes Orson Thorne's supreme creditor. You will own the fate of the Pinnacle and, by extension, you will own him. However, we have a complication, Maren. We are not the only ones circling the carcass." I leaned forward, steepling my fingers. "Tell me about the competitor." "It is a boutique private equity shell company," Marcus replied, the sound of keyboard clacking in the background. "They emerged late Friday afternoon. They are moving aggressively, submitting lowball cash offers and trying to bypass the standard due diligence period. They want to lock down the debt before Orson even realizes it is being sold." Our intelligence team dug through the corporate layers. The shell company is registered in Delaware, but the primary funding source traces back to a series of obscured holding funds managed by a firm in Oakhaven. I felt a dark, cold smile pull at the corners of my mouth. "Let me guess. The managing director of that firm is Lachlan." There was a brief pause on the line. "Correct. How did you know that?" "Because Lachlan is my brother-in-law," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "And he is currently funding his hostile takeover bid with $65,000 he stole from my personal bank account. He thinks he is a shark swimming in the deep end, Marcus. He thinks he is about to steal my father's empire out from under him and emerge as the wealthy savior of the family." "He is highly leveraged," Marcus noted, his tone shifting from professional to predatory. "His shell company is scraping the bottom of the barrel to put together their bid. They are stretched incredibly thin. If we want this debt, we can crush them." "Crush them," I ordered, the words leaving my lips with venomous precision. "Do not just outbid him, Marcus. I want you to obliterate his offer. I want you to drop a mountain of liquid capital on the bank's desk that makes Lachlan's bid look like pocket change. Aegis Logistics generates $45 million a year. We have more than enough cash reserves to swallow this debt without blinking. Secure that paper, regardless of the expenditure. Do not let Lachlan breathe. For the next 48 hours, I waged a silent, brutal war from my office. Lachlan was a desperate man playing with stolen money, trying to execute a hostile takeover on a shoestring budget. I, on the other hand, was operating a massive, fiercely profitable corporate machine. Every time Lachlan's broker submitted a revised offer to the bank, Marcus countered within minutes, offering sums that Lachlan simply could not match. I could almost picture Lachlan sitting in his pristine Oak Haven office, sweating through his custom-tailored suit, frantically making calls to shadow lenders, entirely unaware that the invincible corporate entity outbidding him was the same sister-in-law he had been mocking and stealing from for 6 years. By Wednesday afternoon, it was over. The bank accepted our aggressive cash offer. The transaction cleared. Aegis Logistics, through our subsidiary holding company, now officially owned every single cent of Orson Thorne's construction debt. I held the promissory notes. I held the liens. And sitting in the breast pocket of my blazer, I held the property deed proving that the collateral securing all of it was entirely fraudulent. I stood by the window, watching the sunset paint the industrial yard in shades of fiery orange and deep violet. Lachlan thought he was a cunning wolf, preparing to feast on my father's downfall. He had no idea that a much larger, much darker predator had just swallowed them both whole. The trap was set. The jaws were locked. Now, all I had to do was wait for them to walk into the light. The following morning, my personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID flashed a name I had not seen on a screen in 10 years. Sutton. I stared at the glowing phone for a long time. My sister, the golden child, the woman who had smirked while I was thrown out into the freezing rain, was calling me. I let it ring 4 times before I finally picked up, pressing the phone to my ear without saying a word. Marin? Is that you? Sutton's voice floated through the speaker. It was a bizarre mix of her usual haughty arrogance and a new, brittle underlying panic. It sounded like she was trying to pretend we had merely lost touch after a casual brunch, rather than enduring a decade of bitter estrangement. "Hello, Sutton," I replied, my voice smooth, steady, and revealing nothing. "Wow, you actually picked up," she laughed nervously. "It has been forever. Listen, I know things have been distant between us. Mom mentioned she heard a rumor you were living up north somewhere. I hope you are doing okay, getting by." "I am getting by just fine," I said, leaning back in my chair and inspecting my fingernails. "Why are you calling me after 10 years, Sutton?" She let out an exasperated sigh, playing the role of the overwhelmed, put-upon socialite. "Well, you know how family is. We have to stick together during rough patches. Lachlan and I are dealing with a temporary liquidity issue. It is nothing major, just some funds tied up in escrow for a new investment property. But I have that huge charity gala coming up, and my credit cards are being ridiculously stubborn. I was wondering, since you always lived so frugally, maybe you managed to save up a little something from your warehouse jobs? Could you spot me $5,000? Just for a few weeks." The sheer, unfiltered audacity of her request hit me so hard I almost laughed out loud. After 10 years of ignoring my existence, her very first instinct upon reaching out was to ask for money. But it was the subtext of her words that made my blood run ice cold. "A temporary liquidity issue?" I asked gently, coaxing her further into the trap. "Is Lachlan's firm struggling?" "Oh, heavens no," Sutton scoffed, though her voice shook slightly. "Lachlan is brilliant. He is always moving family assets around to keep our portfolios growing. Honestly, I do not even look at the accounts anymore. Just last year, he tapped into some old family emergency fund Orson set up ages ago to pay for our trip to Aspen and my new Hermes bag. He said it was just sitting there doing nothing. We are fine, Marin. I just need some quick cash to tide me over until Friday." I closed my eyes. There it was. The confession, delivered with staggering ignorance. Sutton believed the $65,000 Lachlan had stolen from my account was just some random family trust fund they were entitled to spend. She had been financing her luxurious vacations, her designer wardrobe, and her carefully curated social image using money stolen directly from the sister she despised. She was a parasite living off the blood of a host she thought was dead. For a brief, fleeting second, I almost felt a shred of pity for her. She was a woman raised on illusions, entirely oblivious to the fact that her husband was a criminal and her perfect life was built on stolen dirt. Almost. I will see what I can do about the funds, I lied smoothly, injecting a tone of meek hesitation into my voice. But you mentioned a gala? Yes. The Pinnacle Revival Gala, Sutton said, her enthusiasm returning instantly. Dad is hosting it at the Oakhaven Community Hall tomorrow night. He is going to announce a massive new investor who is saving the project. The whole town will be there. You should come, Marin. It might be good for you to see how real business is done. Just, please, if you do come, wear something respectable. Try not to embarrass us in front of the mayor. I would not dream of embarrassing the family, I replied, a dark smirk forming on my face. I will be there, Sutton. I will see you tomorrow. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto my desk. I stood up and looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the office window. My sister had told me to dress respectfully. Oh, Sutton. You have no idea. I am not coming to embarrass you. I am coming to erase you. The Oakhaven Community Hall was decorated exactly how my parents preferred everything in their lives, bathed in warm, expensive lighting designed to project an illusion of overwhelming affluence. Velvet drapes hung from the ceilings, crystal centerpieces caught the light on every table, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. It was a lavish, sickening display of wealth funded by the very people Orson was currently scamming. I arrived 15 minutes after the scheduled start time. I wore a tailored, midnight black designer pantsuit. It was unadorned, severe, and radiated an aura of quiet, untouchable power. My hair was pulled back into a sleek knot, and I wore no jewelry. As I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped into the crowded hall, the atmospheric hum of the room noticeably shifted. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. In a town like Oakhaven, everyone knows everyone, and everyone knew the myth of Marin Thorne. Whispers immediately began rippling through the crowd like a virus. I could see the older women in their heavy jewelry leaning into each other, their eyes darting toward me. I heard the word failure, the word disgrace, the question of why the exiled daughter had dared to show her face at such a prestigious event. I ignored them all. My posture was rigid, my chin held high, my eyes scanning the room for my targets. I spotted my parents standing near the front stage area. Orson was holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by a group of anxious local business owners. When his eyes landed on me, the practiced, charismatic developer smile slid right off his face. His expression rapidly morphed from profound shock to deep disdain and finally settled on panicked fury. He shoved his way through the crowd, marching toward me with heavy, aggressive steps. Blythe trailed anxiously behind him, her hands wringing together, desperately trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. Orson grabbed my elbow, his grip tight enough to bruise, and yanked me toward a shadowed alcove near the coat check, away from the prying eyes of his investors. What in the world are you doing here? Orson hissed, his voice a venomous, suppressed whisper. He looked me up and down, clearly thrown by the expensive cut of my suit, but his arrogance quickly overrode his confusion. Are you here to beg for handouts? This event is for investors and respectable members of society. You have no place here. Get out before I have security throw you onto the pavement. I did not pull my arm away. I simply looked down at his hand gripping my sleeve and then raised my eyes to meet his. After 10 years, his very first instinct was still to eject me through a door. I am not leaving, Orson, I said, my voice eerily calm, possessing a cold authority that made him blink in surprise. I was invited. And you're going to want me to stay. Because what happens next concerns both of us. Before Orson could erupt again, Lachlan appeared out of the crowd. His custom suit looked slightly rumpled, and his skin was a terrible, waxy shade of gray. He was sweating profusely. He had clearly just received the news from his broker that his shell company's bid had been annihilated by a massive, anonymous corporate entity. His hostile takeover had failed spectacularly, and he was currently standing in a room full of people he owed money to. Lachlan saw me and forced a strained, agonizingly fake smile. Maren. Wow. What a surprise. Orson, let her stay. It is good to have the whole family together. Lachlan pulled Orson aside, whispering frantically into his ear about needing to delay the speech, but Orson waved him off with a look of supreme irritation. Orson was a man addicted to the spotlight, and he was not going to let his ruined son-in-law or his exiled daughter ruin his moment of glory. Orson straightened his tie, plastered his signature, glowing smile back onto his face, and walked purposefully up the steps to the main stage. He tapped the microphone. The high-pitched whine silenced the room, and the string quartet stopped playing. The entire town of Oakhaven turned their attention to the man who held their life savings in his hands. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, neighbors, Orson began, his voice booming with forced warmth and unshakable confidence. I know there have been rumors. I know there has been anxiety regarding the Pinnacle. But I invited you all here tonight to put those fears to rest permanently. We are entering an extraordinary new phase of development. The crowd murmured, leaning in. The elderly widow from the local church clutched her purse to her chest. Gideon stood near the back, his arms crossed, looking deeply skeptical. I have been in intense, private negotiations, Orson continued, spreading his arms wide to embrace the audience. And I am thrilled to announce that a massive private equity partner has stepped in. An investor with immense capital reserves has secured a major position in our debt, aligning perfectly with my vision to bring unparalleled luxury to Oakhaven. Your investments are secure. The Pinnacle will rise. And our new partner is here tonight to usher us into the future. The auditorium erupted into frantic, relieved applause. People were cheering. Orson stood on the stage, soaking up the adoration, posing as the brilliant savior of the town. He turned toward the side entrance of the hall, extending his arm in a grand, theatrical gesture to introduce the mysterious financial titan he had promised, fully expecting some billionaire in a tailored suit to walk through the doors and shake his hand. The crowd shifted their gaze. The applause slowly died down as the side doors remained firmly shut. Confusion rippled through the room. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs with absolute clarity. I let go of 10 years of silence. I stepped out of the shadows, walked down the center aisle, and headed straight for the stage. The rhythmic clicking of my heels on the hardwood floor was the only sound in the cavernous hall. As I walked down the center aisle, the lingering applause died entirely, replaced by a suffocating, bewildered silence. Hundreds of eyes tracked my movement. They expected a savior. They were getting the town outcast. Orson stared at me from the stage, his extended arms slowly dropping to his side. His charismatic smile fractured, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He leaned into the microphone, trying to salvage the moment. "Security," he stammered, his voice echoing awkwardly. "Security, please escort my daughter out. She is confused. She has no business being up here." I reached the steps and walked up onto the platform. Orson tried to step in front of me, trying to physically block me from the podium, but I did not stop. I walked right past him, moving with a terrifying, unstoppable momentum. I reached out and took the microphone directly from his trembling hand. I did not snatch it. I simply took it, and a shock left him entirely incapable of resisting. I turned to face the audience. I looked at the sea of familiar faces, the wealthy socialites who had mocked me, the local contractors who had pitted me, the elderly investors who were terrified of losing everything. "Good evening, Oakhaven," I said. My voice was steady, projecting clearly through the massive speakers, carrying the weight of a decade of hard-earned authority. "My name is Maren Thorne. For the past 10 years, most of you have been told a very specific story about me. You were told I was a failure, a burden, a disgrace who was living on the streets." I paused, letting the words hang in the heavy air. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Blythe cover her mouth with her hand, shrinking against the back wall. Sutton was standing near the front row, her face drained of all color, looking like she might faint. "But I am here tonight to offer a proper introduction," I continued, my tone shifting into the measured, commanding cadence I used in boardrooms. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Logistics, a commercial warehousing and supply chain enterprise. Last year, my firm generated $45 million in operational revenue." A collective gasp swept through the room, the sound of hundreds of people simultaneously inhaling in shock. The elderly widow in the second row dropped her program. Gideon, standing by the exit, let out a low whistle. "And 3 days ago," I said, turning my head slightly to look directly into my father's horrified eyes, "my firm finalized the partnership my father just spent the last 5 minutes bragging about. The mysterious investor who bought the debt for the Pinnacle is not a stranger. It is me." Orson's complexion turned the color of wet ash. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just watched the ground beneath his feet turn into empty space. "This is impossible," Lachlan yelled from the front row, his voice cracking with desperation. He pushed his way toward the stage, his face red and sweating. "You're lying. You do not have that kind of capital." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I reached into my blazer and pulled out a thick, black leather folder. I dropped it onto the wooden lectern with a heavy, resounding thud. "Let us talk about capital, Lachlan," I said, opening the folder. "Let us talk about the $65,000 you systematically stole from my old dependency account over the last 6 years. Let us talk about how you used those stolen funds to finance your wife's designer wardrobe, and how you tried to use the rest of it in a shadow shell company to buy my father's debt and execute a hostile takeover behind his back." The hall erupted into chaos. People were shouting. Sutton shrieked, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck, turning to stare at her husband in absolute horror. Orson whipped his head toward Lachlan, his eyes bulging with betrayal. Lachlan froze, his mouth hanging open, the realization that he was facing federal wire fraud charges settling over him like a suffocating blanket. I raised my hand, demanding silence. The room quieted down, hungry for the next revelation. I pulled a second document from the folder. "This is the official promissory note for the Pinnacle," I announced, holding the paper up for the crowd to see. "Aegis Logistics now owns every single cent of Orson Thorne's commercial debt. I am his primary creditor." Which brings me to the final piece of business tonight. I turned fully to face my father. He was visibly shaking now. The arrogant, untouchable developer was gone, replaced by a terrified, hollow shell of a man. "When you secure a loan of this magnitude, Orson, you pledge collateral," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly, conversational tone. "You pledge the 60 acres of land on the eastern edge of town. The land the Pinnacle is currently being built on. You told the bank it was family trust property." "It is," Orson shouted defensively, spittle flying from his lips. "It belongs to the Thorne family. It belongs to me." I pulled the final document from the folder, the heavy parchment with the raised county seal. "No, Orson. It does not," I said softly. 8 years ago, Aunt Isolde exercised her right as the senior trustee. She removed the land from the trust and registered a new deed at the county clerk's office. She transferred full, unencumbered ownership of that land to me. I held the deed up high. "You borrowed millions of dollars against real estate that you do not own. You committed massive bank fraud, enabled by a rushed title search. Your collateral is entirely invalid. You own nothing. You control nothing. The Pinnacle belongs to me." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of an empire turning to dust. Orson stared at the deed in my hand, his eyes tracking the signature of his dead sister. He collapsed to his knees right there on the stage. The crowd began to panic. Shouts of anger and terror filled the community hall. The investors, the retirees, the small business owners, they realized that the project was built on fraud, that the collateral was fake, and that their money was trapped in a criminal enterprise. A man in the back yelled that he was going to lose his house. The elderly widow began to openly weep. I stepped back up to the microphone, tapping it sharply twice. The sharp sound cut through the rising hysteria. "Listen to me," I commanded, projecting my voice over the chaos. I did not come here tonight to destroy this town. I came here to excise a cancer. The room slowly quieted down, desperate for any shred of hope. I looked out at the terrified faces. My corporate firm has assumed total control of the Pinnacle, I announced, my voice steady and reassuring. We are immediately halting all construction on the luxury retail spaces. We are restructuring the zoning permits tomorrow morning. The Pinnacle will be redesigned and transformed into a regional commercial logistics and distribution hub for Aegis. It is a highly profitable, sustainable industry that this town actually needs. I took a deep breath, looking directly at the senior citizens in the front rows. Furthermore, my firm is liquidating the fraudulent bonds. Every single private investor in this room will receive a complete, dollar-for-dollar reimbursement of your original principal, plus standard market interest, following a binding written schedule that initiates next Monday. Not a single resident of Oakhaven will forfeit their retirement savings because they placed their faith in the wrong member of the Thorne family. The reaction was instantaneous. The sheer, overwhelming wave of relief hit the room like a physical force. The terrified silence broke into thunderous, genuine applause. It was not the polite, orchestrated clapping Orson had commanded earlier. It was raw, emotional, and deafening. The elderly widow covered her face with her hands, sobbing with relief. Gideon pumped his fist in the air, a massive grin spreading across his face. I stood on the stage, watching the town celebrate their salvation. I felt a profound sense of closure. This was the true revenge. Not just destroying my abusers, but becoming the protector of the people they tried to exploit. The heavy doors at the back of the hall swung open. 2 uniformed police officers walked in, accompanied by a detective in a suit. I had my legal team forward the evidence of Lachlan's wire fraud to the authorities hours before the gala began. Lachlan tried to run toward the side exit, but Gideon stepped firmly in his path, crossing his arms and blocking the door until the officers arrived. They placed Lachlan in handcuffs right there in the aisle. Sutton screamed, dropping to her knees, her expensive designer dress pooling around her on the dirty floor, sobbing as her perfect, fake life was hauled away in steel cuffs. I packed my folders back into my leather case and walked off the stage. I walked right past my mother, who was crying silently against the wall, incapable of looking me in the eye. I pushed through the main doors and walked out into the cool night air. The parking lot was quiet, the sound of the celebrating crowd muffled behind the thick walls of the hall. I walked toward my SUV, feeling lighter than I had in a decade. Marin. Wait. I stopped, my hand on the door handle. I turned around. Orson was stumbling out of the hall, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his bow tie hanging loosely around his neck. He looked ancient. The crushing weight of his ruined legacy had aged him 20 years in 20 minutes. He stopped a few feet away from me, breathing heavily. He looked at me, searching my face for any sign of the desperate, eager-to-please daughter he had thrown into the rain 10 years ago. He found nothing but cold, impenetrable steel. You planned this, Orson gasped, his voice trembling. You planned all of it to destroy me. Are you going to put me in prison? Are you going to take my house? What happens now? Can you ever forgive me? He harbored no genuine remorse. He wasn't apologizing for the abuse, the neglect, or the fraud. He was just a terrified man probing to see if the ledger could be marked clear so he could shed his own emotional burden and avoid jail time. I looked at him, remembering the sound of the deadbolt locking on that freezing night. I am not taking your house, Orson, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I am leaving you with it, so you can sit inside those walls and watch me run this town. As for the fraud, my lawyers will deal with the regulatory fines, but I am not pressing criminal charges. Not because I care about you, but because seeing you humiliated, powerless, and financially irrelevant for the rest of your life is a much worse punishment for a man like you than sitting in a cell. He flinched as if I had struck him. Marin, please. 10 years ago, I said, cutting him off, you yelled at me to go live on the streets. So I did. I walked away and I bought the streets. I bought the dirt you stand on. There is no forgiveness here, Orson, because you no longer have the power to ask for it. You are nothing to me. I opened my car door, climbed inside, and started the engine. I drove out of the parking lot and onto the highway, heading back to Northbridge. I did not check the rearview mirror once. The eventual downfall of a toxic system happens rapidly once the internal load-bearing pillars are removed. 1 month later, the Thorne family's polished facade had entirely disintegrated into dust. Lachlan was indicted on multiple federal charges of wire fraud and embezzlement. When the investigators dug into his accounts, they found a web of illicit transactions that went far beyond the money he stole from me. His private equity firm collapsed overnight. Sutton, suddenly stripped of her stolen wealth and her country club status, was forced to sell her leased cars and her heavily mortgaged home. The last I heard, she moved 3 states away and took a job as a waitress in a town where nobody recognized her last name. Orson lost everything except the primary family residence. The state regulatory board stripped him of his commercial development licenses. He was heavily fined and permanently banned from operating any financial or real estate ventures. The man whose signature once controlled the eastern side of Oakhaven was reduced to a ghost, wandering the empty halls of his house, watching the local news report on the massive success of the new Aegis logistics facility being built on the edge of town. Blythe wrote me a letter late that summer. It arrived in a plain white envelope, written in her shaky, cursive handwriting. There was no grand apology inside. My mother lacked the emotional capacity for genuine accountability. Instead, it was a passive, fragile note, asking gently if I might be willing to meet her for a cup of coffee someday, just the 2 of us. I read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it inside the metal lockbox next to Aunt Isolde's property deed. I never replied. Some doors require neither locking nor entering. You simply leave them closed and walk away. In contrast, my relationship with the town of Oakhaven transformed entirely. The women at the diner who once gossiped about my fabricated drug addiction now spoke my name with hushed, absolute reverence. I was the exiled daughter who returned to slay the dragon and hand the gold back to the villagers. On a crisp Tuesday morning in October, I stood on the edge of the 60-acre construction site. The useless luxury retail framing had been torn down, replaced by the massive, sleek steel skeleton of a state-of-the-art distribution center. The roar of bulldozers and cranes filled the air. It was the sound of progress. It was the sound of real, tangible value being built from the ground up. Gideon, who I had hired as the lead site manager for the project, walked over to me, wiping sweat from his forehead. He handed me a cup of black coffee and smiled, looking out at the massive structure. "We are 2 weeks ahead of schedule, boss," Gideon said, a profound sense of pride in his voice. "The crews are working double shifts. Half the guys on this site lost money in your old man scheme. Now they are getting paid premium wages to build this place. They would walk through fire for you, Marin." I smiled, taking a sip of the coffee. "Keep them safe, Gideon. And make sure the foundation is solid." I walked back to my car, the cold autumn wind whipping through my hair. The burden of my childhood, the heavy, suffocating weight of never being good enough, was finally gone. I had dropped it on that stage in the community hall, and my hands were entirely free to build my own future. The most valuable lesson I learned from the ashes of the Thorne family is this: your worth is never dictated by the people who demand you shrink yourself to make them comfortable. Your value is not handed to you across a dining room table by toxic relatives, nor can it be erased by a father throwing your bags into the rain. You build your worth silently, brick by brick, steel beam by steel beam, in the dark. You build it until the fortress is so tall, so undeniably real, that the people who locked you out find themselves standing at your gates, begging for entry. When a toxic family brands you a worthless loser, do not argue with them. Do not plead for their understanding. Just walk away into the dark and start building. Let your success be the loudest, most devastating sound they ever hear. Many people have told me that I was too cold, too ruthless in how I handled my father and brother-in-law. They say I should have resolved the theft and the fraud privately, keeping the family drama behind closed doors instead of publicly humiliating them and sending Lachlan to prison. But what do you think? Was I a cold-blooded monster for dropping that nuclear bomb on the stage, or was it the exact price they deserved to pay for a decade of abuse and theft? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If you found satisfaction in seeing a toxic family finally face the consequences of their actions, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We have plenty more stories of soft-spoken people who waited for the perfect moment to turn the tables. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.